Okay, there we go. So I guess if Angela, can you speak? Would you be able to read? Because you're on your phone, right?
I am on my phone.
Would you be able to read something? If not, that's okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to make things come into focus with my glasses.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I should be able to read something.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. So let's do it this way. Since I know we're a smaller crowd this time. Megan, would you mind being the liturgist?
Sure.
Okay. And let's see, I guess, Rob, can you be voice of the people? I'm sorry, I didn't have the screen up. Can you be voice of the people?
Thumbs up. Sorry, that was yeah.
Okay, I had a different screen pulled up. Okay, and then I'll read the Old Testament reading, and Angela, could you read the New Testament reading?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's see. Any other roles? I think that'll be it. Okay. Sweet. So let me see. I guess we're it today. For those of you just coming on board, this is St. Junia United Methodist Church. We are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. And glad to have you join us today. I'm coming to you from Chicago. Actually, Angela and I are in Chicago, and we're short a few of our usual panelists, but we're glad that you're here with us today. So let's go ahead and get rolling. I'll go ahead and put the liturgy up on the screen. All right.
Welcome. On this day in 1906, Mahatma Gandhi coined the term satyagraha to describe the way of nonviolence. It actually means holding fast to the truth. His strategy of nonviolent resistance ultimately led to the end of British colonial rule in India and inspired generations of organizers and activists who came after him. Today is also the feast day of Saint Paphnutius, an Egyptian bishop who lost an eye under Roman persecution. He was a disciple of Saint Anthony, one of the first desert fathers and mothers. He was at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, and though he himself was celibate, opposed requiring celibacy for priests. Today also marks the anniversary of September 11th attacks on World Trade Center in 2001. Today we draw a circle, not of exclusion, but of inclusion.
Our God has revealed that God's nature is love.
And the glory of God is a human being fully alive.
We come to be students of love and of life.
To learn and to teach, to share the wisdom of our ancestors.
Draw near and let us break together the bread of life.
How long, Holy One, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?
How long will I counsel myself, sorrow in my heart every day?
How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Look, answer me, faithful one, my God.
Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep into death. Then my enemy will say, I have prevailed over him.
My foes will rejoice because I am shaken.
Yet I trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation.
I will sing to the womb of life.
Because she has poured goodness on me.
Our Hebrew Bible reading is from 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 and following. And it was that when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day after being dismissed by the Philistine ruler, the Amalekites raided the Negeb and Ziklag. They smote Ziklag and burned it with fire, and they took captive the women who were in it, from young to old. They did not kill any, rather they led them away and went their way. So when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned and their wives and daughters and sons taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until there was no more strength in them to weep. Now the two wives of David had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. David was in great distress, for the people said to stone him, because the souls of all the people were embittered on account of their daughters and sons. And David strengthened himself in the Holy One his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David questioned the Holy One of old, asking, "Shall I pursue this band? Will I overtake them?" God answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and you shall surely rescue." So David smote them from twilight until the evening of the morrow. None of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And David rescued all who the Amalekites took. David rescued his two wives. None was missing, whether young or old, daughters or sons, spoil or anything that they took for themselves. David brought back everything.
Matthew 18:10. Jesus said, See to it that you do not treat one of these little ones with contempt. I say to you that their angels in the heavens see the face of my Abba, who is in the heavens all day, every day. What do you think? If a person had 100 sheep and one of them wandered off, would they not leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of the one that wandered off? If they find it, truly I tell you that they rejoice over it more than over the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, it is not the will of your Abba who is in the heavens that one of these little ones should be lost. May God bless the hearing of this word.
Thanks be to God.
Mahatma Gandhi said, "Prayer is not asking. It is a longing of the soul. It is a daily admission of one's weakness. It is better in prayer to have a heart without words than words without a heart." He also said, "When I despair, I remember that all through history the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always."
So we'll go into a time of prayer. I'll get us started. And if you are either on the Zoom call or if you're on Facebook or YouTube, can some of us look at YouTube or Facebook to gather comments as well? I can look at Facebook. Can someone check out YouTube or vice versa?
I could do YouTube.
Okay, thank you. So we'll pray. If you would like to lift up a prayer concern, you're on the Zoom call, feel free to put it in the chat. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, if you want to put it in the comments, we'll be glad to read it out loud and lift up in prayer also. Also, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, if you want to interact, you can click like or you can leave a comment of where you're watching from. That just gives us a way to know that you're here with us, to count your attendance. So we appreciate you being with us today. Let's go to God in prayer. God, we give you thanks that you do not want to leave anyone behind, that it is your goal ultimately to save everyone and everything, that nothing is wasted, no one forgotten, no one left alone. In the midst of our loneliness and when we feel ready to despair, please remind us that we are surrounded by a whole host of ancestors and heavenly beings, and that you hold us up with your hand. We lift up all those who are in despair, those who feel conquered, and those who feel lost. We lift up to you places that are overtly experiencing war and strife, places like Ukraine, places like Ethiopia and Somalia, places like our backyards. We lift up to you also up to you places that, though there may not be an overt war, there is one under the surface in families and relationships, in our political life. We lift up to you ourselves and our brokenness and our planet in its hurt. Again, remembering that it is not your will that we march toward destruction, but that life and love always overcome. And so we name to you situations that are close to our hearts, and we name them before you now. I invite those of you watching to share. For Teresa's grandparents and Teresa's mom.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For Shelby and all those affected by the wildfires.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For Vicky McCarthy.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For those who still bear the scars of 9/11 and for the continued healing of a divided nation.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For transgender children and adults and those seeking abortion care.
Lord, hear our prayer.
With gratitude for rain.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For flood victims in Pakistan.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For victims of climate change all across the world.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For the United Methodist denomination and in gratitude for the witness of bishops in Africa.
Lord, hear our prayer.
God, for all the things that we name and for the things that we do not name, for, as Gandhi said, our hearts without words, we lift all these things up to you and we give you thanks because you hear and you answer. And so we join with the church in all places and all times that have prayed words inspired by your Son, Jesus Christ. Holy One, our Mother and Father, let your name be revered. Let your reign come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in the heavens. Give us today the bread we need for today, and forgive our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For yours is the sovereignty, the power, and the glory, now and forever. Amen. So it's good to be with you again. It's sort of has been an interesting re-entry. I was with y'all a couple of weeks ago, and we had one more trip to make for our grant, our time away, and now I'm back with you again. And I'm kind of picking up from where I left off 2 weeks ago in the story of David. Now I've shared with you before, I love this story of David. Ever since I was a kid, my ears would perk up because it was my name. And so I loved hearing stories about David. But like many people who grew up in church, I grew up thinking David was always a hero in these stories. And a couple of weeks ago, I really wanted to make the point that David is not always the hero. That sometimes David is, and if we read it that way, we risk missing a huge amount of, I think, the author's intention in these stories. And so today's story is really a story about David at his lowest, or possibly not quite his lowest. I think his lowest came a few years later, but this was one of the places he was very, very low. I shared that 2 weeks ago that people are surprised sometimes when we're telling the story of David to learn that David actually was a mercenary for the Philistines. We all know the story of David and Goliath. David beat Goliath. Goliath was the Philistines. The Philistines are the bad guys, right? Well, when David was chased out of Israel and Judah by Saul, he sought refuge with the Philistines, the folks he had been fighting previously. There was a lot of resentment, right, among the Philistines, that the king of the Philistines welcomed David and said, "Oh, it's one of these keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of things." So David comes and joins in with the king, and then he becomes a mercenary. He makes his living, and here's where this story gets set up, okay? For several years, he makes his living by raiding villages. So he is not a good guy. This is like, he's the anti-hero. He's Walter White in Breaking Bad. He is, when you're watching The Godfather, he's the gangster that you're rooting for. He was a gangster. He was going and extorting people and taking their property. And then this story picks up with, he's just been dismissed. So the Philistines that didn't like David finally got the king to fire him. So David gets fired. He goes home and he finds out that his village has been raided. Now, I want to set this up because, oftentimes David's the hero. I think this is the way the author is saying, look, what goes around comes around. So David has been a warlord for a long time, and now he's experiencing what he has been inflicting on other people. Now, I'm going to be honest. I don't know that the author is that moralistic about it. I think some of the author is in some ways just telling a story. I don't know that he sees this the same way I see it, but I see this as a turning point for David. David comes back and he experiences grief at someone else has come when he wasn't there to protect his people, and they've taken his people. They've taken his family. And all the people who were with him, I think the words are really powerful. They wept until they didn't even have strength to weep anymore. I mean, the despair and the grief is very real here. And again, I think David has been on the dishing out end for so long that now that he's on the receiving end, this is a new experience for him. He also has one of these sort of crises of leadership things. Now, this happens several times in the Bible. People are so angry at the leaders that the people with them, their followers, are threatening to stone him. That happened to Moses and Aaron. It's happened to other people, other leaders that have preceded David. So this kind of puts him, now he's in the same role that a lot of other leaders of Israel have been in, where the people you're supposed to be leading are so angry at you that they're ready to kill you. What he does next is he assumes the role of a priest. He calls Abiathar to bring him the ephod. Now, I know these are kind of funky names, funny words. The ephod was a chest plate that the priest wore, and in the chest plate were tools for divining the will of God. Now, this was sort of the role the priests did back in the day. And people have had different interpretations of what the actual method was. Some people have said it was a bag with different colored stones, and you would ask a question, you'd pull a stone out, and that's how you would have an answer, depending upon the color of the stone. So it's a little bit like a magic 8-ball. So if you can imagine, the priest comes with a magic 8-ball, and David says, shall I chase these people who've stolen our families, shakes the magic 8-ball, looks at it, and it says, reply hazy, ask again. He shakes it again, and it says, my answers indicate yes, right? That's the nature of divination. So, and I know that may sound flip or it may sound irreverent. That's what they were doing. This is divination. Okay. It's not like God said, spoke from the heavens and said, go overtake and rescue your people. This is a practice of trying to figure out the will of God by looking for a sign. People do this all over the world in a lot of different ways. Let's be honest. Sometimes we do it privately. Oh God, if this is your answer to me, give me a sign. I'm looking for a sign. Oh, look, there's a bird flying backwards. Whatever it happens to be, right? So the mailman comes and knocks on the door. Oh, that's my sign. Divination, again, interestingly, in some parts of the Hebrew Bible is condemned as witchcraft. You shouldn't be doing divination, right? And there's a variety of ways. People consult the bones in some cultures. The sacrificial animal, you look at the way the bones fall, and the way the bones fall is supposed to tell you something about God's will for the life. You're looking for order in chaos. That's divination. So David does this, and he gets a response. So this is kind of a rabbit trail, but I really want people to understand when they read these kinds of stories, to understand what's going on with the characters, because most likely you've been in a situation where you felt a little bit desperate and you were asking for a sign, right? Most of us, when we pray, when we're looking for discernment, when we're wanting wisdom, we want some kind of leadership. We want someone to show us what the right answer is. And in the story, we have kind of a nested example of that. David's looking for a sign from God, right? His people are looking for a sign from the leader. They don't feel like they're getting what they want, and they want to kill him. Yeah? I think that's also a great example. When we are looking for a sign, when we are wanting leadership from God, and God isn't giving us what we want to kill him. Or that may look in a lot of different ways. That might look like disbelieving. That might look like, anger with God. Those are all perfectly understandable. I think in many ways, that's what people were looking for from Jesus. He didn't give them the leadership that they wanted, and they decided to kill him. So I do think theologically, when we're reading this story, now I don't know that the author intended this. I don't know that it was intended by the way God inspired the Bible, but I feel like this is a great story about crisis and how crisis brings us to these points of looking for signs. I think in this story, it's a change of, maybe not a change of heart, but I think it has the potential to be a change of heart for David, for him to recognize that what he's been dishing out is now what he's receiving. Hopefully it makes him a wiser person. But divination, looking for signs, looking for leadership, it's part of the human condition. So then David answers what the divine message says. He goes and he chases, and I love the way the author puts it. He rescues everybody. The author repeats it several times. No one was missing. Everything was brought back. Let me pull it up again so I can see it for myself, because I love the way the author puts it. He rescued all whom the Amalekites took. He rescued his 2 wives, just in case you didn't get that. None was missing, whether young or old, daughters or sons, spoil or anything they took for themselves, and David brought back everything 4 times. So in the Bible, whenever something's repeated, you know that that's important to the author. So 3 times is usually pretty significant. 4 times, yes, every last thing was brought back. It was, and you can tell, like, for the author, this is a miracle, right? So he got the answer. He got the sign he wanted. He went and he answered. We brought back everything. Robert's comment is, it's like the end of the Grinch, right? Every last thing is restored. He puts all the toys back, right? So the completeness of the restoration is what the author is emphasizing. Okay, great story. I'm going to shift just a minute. That New Testament passage, which I think is so wonderfully laid on top of the Hebrew Bible passage in today's readings. Wilda Gaffney's done a great job putting these two together. This is a little different than the same story that we hear in Mark, where I think the point is a little bit different. The idea is when Jesus tells the parable, he asks in Mark, who doesn't leave 99 sheep in the wilderness to go after one, right? And the answer is nobody does that. Nobody. In the Gospel of Mark, the point is that's a crazy thing for a shepherd to do, but that's the kind of God we have. That God is more delighted over rescuing someone than over 99 sheep, and the idea is who think they don't need rescuing, right? Well, in this story, Matthew's point is a little bit different. Matthew's emphasizing, and he frames it on either side of the story. Jesus says to the people listening, these little ones have angels in heaven that are in front of God all the time, every day, all day, every day. So there is divine protection, there's divine concern for the most vulnerable. And similarly, in this story, the emphasis is on God doesn't want anyone to go missing. Like God's concern is for the most vulnerable all the time. And the emphasis is that God is going to get what God wants. God's going to restore everything. God's going to rescue everybody. No one's going to be missing and nothing's going to be wasted. So the story in Matthew, the parable in Matthew, to me, emphasizes, I think, what the author is getting at here, that God's concern is for an ultimate restoration of everybody and everything. And oftentimes when we talk about salvation, when we talk about the point of religion, the point of Christianity, it's about how we earn something or how we get into heaven or saying the right prayer, getting your ticket punched, and so you can go on to salvation. And I think this is one of those stories that really puts the emphasis on what God is doing. God is going to rescue everybody. That the concern that David feels, the loss, the grief that David feels is nothing compared to what God feels. That God is intimately concerned with every last supposedly insignificant one of us. So that's what I want to share with you today in these two stories. That's how they speak to me. I'd love to hear your response, how they speak to you, or other comments, questions, things you get out of these stories.
I really love the sort of like thinking about the stories of David having a bit of a satirical angle.
Yeah.
And I mean, I agree that like there does seem to be a serious change of perspective for David in this particular story. I mean, it seems, as a mercenary, you're not exactly focused on, your values, your values are money or wealth or, getting somebody's wife. Like,
Yeah.
like so I wonder if there's also sort of an angle of like God's complete forgiveness in this case, because David is being a terrible person up to this point. And I mean, God is like, you know what? Okay, if you're willing to talk again, then here is everything. You can have it all back.
Yeah, interesting.
This is not about punishment, and it's not about getting your due. I mean, it did happen. Like these people did get taken away, and his city got, but God is like, no, okay, here, everything. You can have everything back.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, Robert.
I really feel some of the subtext here when David is consulting the magic 8 claw, right? That like he knows what he has dished out in the past. So, I mean, the reason that they're all so bereft when they get there, it's not like they can see them just going over the horizon, like we just got here in the nick of time, and there they are, and I see
Right.
my wife, and let's go get them, right? They think everybody's dead,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
That's what they think.
Mhm.
So this whole consulting the magic 8 ball, like the question, it's as if David doesn't dare put this question into words. Is anyone alive?
Mm.
Is there any hope?
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? You know, he's framing it essentially as, do I go after them? Because if I go after them, if it's worth it to go after them, I guess that means somebody's alive. Don't even know who, but maybe there are some people alive. Maybe we can get something back.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That feels really important to me, because that speaks exactly to what Megan is pointing at, right? That, you know, this, I mean, it's encapsulating that implicit potential of the restoration of all things, you know, that like, no, go after them.
Yeah.
Because everything can be fixed, right? It's like we pray at the end of every service, nothing is wasted.
Mhm.
You know, I think the ability to trust, like to trust God, that nothing is wasted, that somehow things can work out ultimately. It feels like the inability to do that has actually shaped an enormous amount of theology and created a lot of suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is, when David does the divination, it is more like, do I despair? Is this the point I give up? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, great point. Yeah, Megan?
I think an additional element of the divination, like deciding, like, okay, go get the priest, you know, like it's kind of a constitutional crisis. You know, if David were PM, they would be telling him to move out of Downing Street. But but he's like, okay, if I can make what I do seem like God's idea, you know, maybe the people won't stone me, and it worked. But God is like, wait a minute, this is about something else. But
Yeah.
you know, so there's that sort of, because all, you know, the stories, like sort of propaganda stories about David, you know, killing Goliath and all that, like the, you know, sort of setting him up to be like, well, of course he's going to be king, you know, he was God's chosen person. And like, I think this is another example of that, but God sort of uses it to make a different point, you know?
Right. Yeah, I mean, like kind of as Rob was saying, if he had chased after and they hadn't recovered anybody, like that would have been a very different outcome. Yeah. So, yeah. Other thoughts, perspectives on this? Would someone read Teresa's comment?
Sure. Oh, it looks like Camille commented as well.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Here.
Yeah.
I'll start with Camille.
Please do.
As Dave pointed out, people really do want God to tell them everything will be okay. They want to know the future, how much to gamble on the future as opposed to taking that leap of faith.
Yeah.
And Teresa says, okay.
No, go ahead.
Teresa says, it is pretty interesting to me how David seems to be struggling with the fact that he's a part of an oppressive system. Whether he's on the receiving end or the times when he realizes he's the bad guy, it's been on my mind a bit that even the most lovable monarchs and royals are at the top of an oppressive system, and how sometimes people seem surprised when you point that out. Like the one who just died. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, that has been an interesting thing, hasn't it? Yeah, there's, as we saw on social media and different responses to the Queen's death, there are a lot of people, of course, who love the Queen. I mean, I'll admit I'm kind of an Anglophile in many ways myself. I don't follow the royals and stuff like that, but it's to many colonized people, this is like a Confederate flag. And so seeing the monarchy propped up, and even if we look back at the Bible, as we said 2 weeks ago, when Samuel was talking about the king, he said, look, if you guys want a king, this is what it's going to mean. King's going to take all the best stuff. King's going to treat you like garbage. You're asking for a hierarchy when I'm trying to help you live in a society without hierarchies. So this is what that's going to mean for you. And people said, yes, that's what we want. That's exactly what we want. David also, in many chapters later, when he decides that he really wants to build the temple, at least one of the interpretations is, you can't build the temple because you have too much blood on your hands. Like you have killed, you had to do the dirty work to unite the empire or to unite the kingdom. But because of that dirty work, you are not fit to build the temple. And that was, kind of a shock. Yeah. It's built on violence, right? And even though like we read these stories, and I mean, they're exciting stories, they're interesting stories, I do think there's a tension in there. Like God doesn't really want this for us, right? I mean, that is really what this means, that to be more violent than the other guy so that we win, and that's somehow what God wants. Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
We saw at a museum, they were talking about I'm trying to avoid language that makes it sound like progress. That just changes over time in social systems,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of the invention of what we now take for granted as government,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they were making the point that, like, there's this sort of anthropological tripod, right, of like economic power, ideological or religious power, and then police or military power, but I would just say state violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how two legs have a relationship with the third leg, all the way around that tripod, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that great quote from Ursula Le Guin where she talks about how we live in capitalism and its power seems as inescapable as the divine right of kings, right? But like there's even something more fundamental, because we're really only talking about a certain set of relationships or a certain set of subtext in that context. But I just thought that was really interesting, this whole idea of like ways of living that situate economics in power terms, that depend on state violence, and that are essentially ideologically constituted.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why, when you start trying to perturb any of that, it's like, what do you even imagine?
Yeah.
People have tried, they come up with anarchy and things like that, but it shows you how much stuff is in the water. It's in the air we breathe, right? They're the assumptions that you don't even realize are assumptions, things you don't even think of questioning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when David is going about this project of setting up an interlocking system of protection rackets so that he can have power, it's motivated by all that. I mean, pulling out the magic 8 ball is an exercise of ideology and state violence together, in large measure designed to go protect our economic power that we saw just got taken from us, and to which we have some degree of sentimental attachment because wives and kids, but also as a lot of wealth. Like, I just don't even know. I don't even know how to unpack that. All I can do is see it.
Yeah, no, but I think it is tough to unpack. Yeah, I mean, I don't. So one thing I think, and I think this happens a lot in preaching and in telling these stories, is that the idea is that you tell the story and then there's a moral you take from it. Like there's one simple thing. Like, so the story is always trust God and pray before you act. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard people say you should always ask God before you make any significant decision, and that's the moral of the story you're getting from this. Really? Anyway, no, I appreciate that, because I think it is a complex set of interlocking forces, and like, is God in here somewhere? Anyway, go ahead, Megan.
Well, so Chris asked the perfect question for what I was about to say, which is, I have a question. Why do you think the Hebrews clamored to have a king in the first place?
Oh gosh.
And
Yeah.
I mean, feel free to talk about that, but
We'll come back to it in just a minute. Yeah.
yeah, my thought was, so whenever I've heard it preached, heard preachers talk about the sort of shift from, what they would call theocracy
Mhm.
to, Saul and then
Mhm.
David and so on. It's always been about, well, God should have the final authority. He should be our real authority.
Mhm.
But maybe that's not what God was trying to say with like the 10 Commandments, I mean, maybe it was just like, come on, you guys, you can do this yourselves. Don't be terrible to each other,
Mhm.
and you'll be all right. You don't have to have somebody with their foot on your neck,
Mhm.
And I'm trying to break you free of that. And I mean, that's certainly what Jesus seems to be saying, like circling back to. So maybe it's not, I mean, the authority part is what's broken about what people
Mhm.
brought to the system.
I would tend to agree with that. I do think, yeah, the way it's often portrayed, as you said, is that the Israelites sinned because they wanted a king to look like other nations, etc. But the whole idea, what they were setting up before, was really kind of a if everyone does this, things will be fine. And that there was the whole idea was kind of this is going to be our culture, and we're not going to need a king. I mean, they just came from Pharaoh, for Christ's sakes. Pardon me. Like they were slaves under a very strong emperor, right? And then you're like, okay, we're going to go back to that, and there is that sense of like, even as they're escaping, like, oh, we were going to go back to where this was secure and stable. And so I think, to speak to Chris's question, why did they want a king in the first place? I do think it's a way of externalizing an authority that you're given, right? I mean, that we, the group is given. We're given this authority, and we're like, oh yeah, we don't really want that. Let's give someone else that responsibility. And I would like to think, and of course, this is my bias, because I think democracy is a good thing, and I think people should have a say, and the sort of collectivist idea that we should be able to do things on our own instead of having a boot on our neck. But I do think there's a strong element of that running throughout the Hebrew Bible, that we don't need we don't need a master, because God is our master, and that there's this very strong democratic ideal, or at least egalitarian ideal, in what the Hebrew Bible is saying. I'm preaching again, so I'm gonna stop and let's get back to some of the questions in there.
There's some great comments.
Yeah.
Camille says, we always speak of God and Christ as king, but if you look at it through what I suppose I just said about Saul, it does help to create an ideology that leads to religious extremism, since those who want a king want to be ruled and to give up their personal agency.
Yeah. And I think that also speaks to the whole idea of the flip that Jesus does as king, is say, I'm not a king like these other kings, right? I mean, the whole idea is the kingdom is among you. The reign of God is among y'all, and it is a y'all, instead of saying Caesar's king, right? Anyway, yeah.
And then Rob says we should be ruled by God, not by mere mortal chuckleheads.
Right.
And yeah. I love this. The 10 Commandments as the rules for not toxifying society.
Yeah. So I have to say, like, one of the things that we do when we're leading like group therapy or group process or group whatever, when you get a group of people together, so one of the first things you do is you say, okay, what are our ground rules? How are we gonna work together as a group? And I do think the 10 Commandments are kind of like that. It's these are our ground rules. If we do these things, we should be okay. Yeah.
Chris says peer pressure king. Which yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it does. I think that you can't not think about how unsettling it is to do something different, you know, and how, you know, they were sort of like out literally floating in the desert, you know, trying to come up with how they wanted to be as a people.
Well, and I always, so like what you just said, so the geography of that place, I mean, they were between Egyptian Empire, Babylonian and Sumerian Empire, right? And what is the Code of Hammurabi, which said God gave the king these things, right? And so there's this pathway. So like there's God and there's a king, and then I'm giving the law to all you people, versus Moses, which was really like, this is the law for the people, right? I realize there's Moses is still kind of intermediary, but Moses was not a king, and that was kind of a point, right? Moses was a prophet, not a king. And the idea that God is giving the message through a prophet, not a king, that's a statement back to the other empires that surround them. Like, we are not like y'all. Anyway.
Yeah. It's more of a suggestion when it's a prophet, I guess. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, Rob said, it's just too hard to rely on ourselves to be decent. We need someone holding the leashes. There's like a lot of responsibility there. Teresa says, if every other country jumped off a bridge, would you too? Heck yeah.
Yes, Mom. Yes, Mom. Yeah.
And Chris says, we see this historically time and again when people are convinced that an individual could make decisions that are fair and equitable for the people. How many times has that been successful?
Yeah.
And then Camille says, seems many forgot that God made us in their image. We each contain within the right to make the decisions that used to be left to kings. Yeah.
I think those are all great points. And you, Rob, a little while ago, you kind of alluded to this idea of progress, that somehow that we are making progress, right? In terms of how society organizes itself, and you know, I do think in the Hebrew Bible that part of what, as Camille pointed out, we're all made in the image of God, and that there is this sort of radically egalitarian thing that says it's not that society should not be pyramid structured, like all of us on the base with one at the top that's connected to God. That, you know, it flips the pyramid and says that God is at the base. And I mean, what I get from sort of the Hebrew theological political world is that that we really are that we really should be more equitable, right? That the concern for widows, orphans, aliens, people who are socially vulnerable and disenfranchised is a reflection of that concern for God, that it really is a leveling thing. Kings ain't nobody. And when I think about our own society, our own world, and who's on top, and kind of the place we are in, I think in this historical moment where I do think there's a lot of resentment that we seem in many ways to be moving backwards, toward feudalism, towards a place where there's such enormous economic inequality that you have 0.001% of the population controlling most of the world's wealth and calling most of the shots and having disproportionate political influence. What's the religion? What's the spirituality that undercuts that pulls that crap down? And I think that's kind of what we're called to have, that we're called to, if there's good news in the world, that's part of the good news, that the people on top don't call the shots. Anyway, yeah. I see Chris's comment, so I'm going to say this. How did we get to the schism where so many American Christians want a physical earth priest king? Yeah, earth priest king is great. That's what it's so much. It's just that tendency in it, in people that I think the Bible condemns, right? It's like, this is not a good thing. It's hard to get past that. Yeah. I know we've got a few more minutes, but I do kind of want to begin to wrap up. I want to thank you all for being here today for such a wonderful conversation. And next week we'll be back in, or tomorrow I'll be back in Birmingham, and we will do this again. I'm back for a few weeks. I do have another thing I've got to be at in a couple of weeks, but I really appreciate y'all, and I'm glad that y'all are here after being gone for most of the summer, so that we can continue conversation and worship online. For those of you watching, if you're in the Birmingham area, next Sunday, I do want this announcement out there. I'm going to be doing at 3 in the afternoon I'm a certified nature and forest therapy guide. We're going to be doing an outdoor forest bathing kind of thing. I think it'd be, again, a good opportunity to get together in person in a non-COVID dangerous kind of situation, and connect with the world around us and connect with each other. So if you're in Birmingham, 3 o'clock Sunday next, we'd love to see some people at that. Let's go ahead and move into our closing. Let's see.
From a Hindu prayer. My soul, listen unto me. Love thy Lord as the lotus loves water. Buffeted by waves, its affection does not falter. Creatures that have their being in water, taken out of water, die. My soul, if you have no such love, how will you obtain release? If the word of the wise is within us, we shall accumulate a store of devotion. Amen.
God is love. Nothing is wasted. All things shall be well. Go in peace.
Again, thanks for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream. Those of you on Zoom, if you'll stick around for just a minute, thank you all for being with us. Again, if you've been on Facebook or YouTube, if you don't mind liking or commenting with where you're watching from, that gives us a way to count you. Thanks a bunch.